Harvard Divinity School.
Psychedelics, a Visual Odyssey, September 17th, 2024.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Psychedelics in the Future of Religion event for the fall 2024 semester. For those of you who I have not had the chance to meet, my name is Jeffrey Breau, and I have the good fortune of serving as the program lead, along with Paul Gillis-Smith, for the Psychedelics and Spirituality program at the Center for the Study of World Religions. The Psychedelics and the Future of Religion series, which this talk is a part of, is now entering its fourth year. The series marks an important node in the larger psychedelics and spirituality programming and research happening at the center. And it is important to note that the Psychedelics and Spirituality program is itself embedded in the center's ongoing and evolving initiative called Transcendence and Transformation, or TNT for short. For today's conversation, we are joined by Dr. Erika Dyck, who will be speaking about her new book, Psychedelics, a Visual Odyssey, which I am holding here, which is published by MIT Press. To give a sense for how today's conversation will unfold, in a moment, I will turn the floor over to Paul to introduce himself and Dr. Dyck. Then we will both disappear, and Erika will take center screen to share a bit about her text and her work. Following her presentation, the three of us will appear back on screen to continue a discussion of the book and address questions from the audience. With that introduction out of the way, I will pass things over to Paul to introduce himself and Erika Dyck.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and hello, everyone. I'm Paul Gillis-Smith, also program lead for Psychedelics and Spirituality here at the Center. Without further ado, I will introduce our speaker today. Erika Dyck is Professor of History at the University of Saskatchewan and Canada Research Chair in the History of Health and Social Justice. She's the author of Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, and Facing Eugenics, Reproduction, Sterilization, and the Politics of Choice. She's co-author of The Acid Room, The Psychedelic Trials and Tribulations of Hollywood Hospital, and co-editor of Expanding Mindscapes, A Global History of Psychedelics, alongside many others. She's also a board member of Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. Professor Dyck, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul and Jeffrey, for that very kind introduction, and for inviting me back to your series, which is just very exciting to be part of this. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully that's working okay, and if it isn't, somebody will let me know. I'm really delighted to be here this afternoon or this evening where you are, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for being here and engaging in this, and also to explain that, as Paul mentioned, I've been spending time in the archives and writing books about the history of psychedelics for over 20 years now. And this book, the Psychedelics, a Visual Odyssey, was really a stretch for me in ways that, both have, introduced me to new people and new ways of thinking about this history, but have also been it's also been a really humbling experience as I realized that sometimes the illustrations that lie behind or sometimes adjacent to this history have helped to change some of my ideas around the history of psychedelics as well. So I put together a few slides here to give you a bit of a sample or a taste of the book itself. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge, I saw one of the questions already popped up about Richard Schulte's book, which I happen to have a Spanish copy of it here, a signed copy. So I decided it was okay to have it in Spanish, even though I'm still quite rudimentary in my Spanish. And I'm really pleased that this has made the front cover of the book. This is actually, just to start us off, this was a book that was illustrated by Elmer Smith. It was published in the Golden Guide to Introduction to Hallucinogens or Hallucinogenics. And the image here is actually a compilation of some of the many kinds of images that you find as illustrations in that book. And so I was really pleased to get a copy from Kat Harrison at Botanical Dimensions Library, and really happy that that's on the front cover. And I wanted to emphasize that because what I hope this book accomplishes, or what I hope it stimulates at least, is conversations about the many ways that psychedelics and even precursors to psychedelics, different ideas about these concepts and these plants, these chemicals, have inspired different ways of imagining a different kind of diverse illustrations or diverse ways of thinking about these non-ordinary states of consciousness and our relationship with one another and our relationship to the planet. So I wanted to start by framing this up with two different images that you'll find very early in the book. On the right-hand side of the screen is a Rick Griffin image from the San Francisco Oracle. I found it in black and white, and I prefer this one in color that I think is a really striking image of what is described, at least in the caption here, in a 1967 post as a Huichol man. And kind of around him, you can see, maybe you can identify even some of the different psychedelic plants. There are perhaps peyote buttons at his feet, and you'll see different images there that may be reminiscent or maybe, remind you of some of these different psychedelic plants. And I can't decide what the expression is on his face specifically, but I like this image that is both a kind of reminds us of that 1967 moment. Psychedelics have moved into the mainstream. There are shout outs or kind of elements of reach back to Indigenous cultures that have come to bring, come to play a large role in how we understand psychedelics in the 1960s. But there's also a kind of, I don't know, maybe a bit of a forlorn expression on his face. And perhaps this is something that we should heed, as well as maybe seeing psychedelics as coming to an end of a certain kind of era of psychedelics in the 1960s. If we flip over to the left-hand side of the screen, this is an AI-generated image, so I cannot credit an author on this one. And this is, an image that I think in many ways sort of captures our imagination when we think about perhaps the future, or maybe that's a scary image in and of itself, or maybe it's an exciting image to you, this idea that we can, harness the power of, in this case, mushrooms in this beaker, produced, of course, in an AI way as well. We have people are almost entirely removed from this situation. And I wanted to kind of use that as ways of launching into this, into what won't be a proper talk, but I'll give you a couple of ideas of things or themes that I tried to illustrate in the book. All right. So what I wanted to do initially, and the word psychedelic is in the title, and I hope you will forgive me for using the term, but the concept that I want to drive at here is different ways that people have sought out non-ordinary experiences across time and place. And to do so, I didn't want to have the book follow some of the narratives that I've followed in my own writings on this, which is, clinical experimentation exclusively, or necessarily look at ceremonies exclusively, or creativity. We might even think about recreational uses, but I really wanted to blend these ideas together and think about the diverse ways that people have encountered these experiences. And so, although there's a chronology to this, I also want to kind of shake some of our ideas loose on this, or maybe problematize that a little bit. And so these are some of the images. What I want to emphasize here as well is some of these may be familiar to you. Maybe you've seen these before. Maybe you've even had your hands on some of that blotter acid here, the shout out to the Grateful Dead. And some of the images that I produce in the book and that I will share with you today are quite rare. Images that came out of a shoebox in someone's closet, something that had been kept on a roll of film in the image on the top there, images that have been kept sometimes secret, or sometimes because there was nobody asking questions about where these images came from, and so they just stayed dormant for a while. And that's the other thing that was really exciting about working on this book, was trying to find that nice blend, images that people are expecting to see, but also to sort of challenge us in some ways in moving outside of the ordinary, as I hope this book would transcend the psychedelic bubble and even, excite or inspire people who are less familiar with psychedelics. And so to give you a couple of examples of where I'm coming from, or the kind of work that went into this, I wrote the text for this, and then I was told quite bluntly, and much to my horror and sadness, that very few people are going to actually read the text, really concentrate on the images. And this was a whole new adventure for me. This is not something I'd ever done before. Images for me were always illustrative. It's a nice image, it's a nice picture, it's a nice depiction, but the words were something that I held very sort of sacred and sacrosanct. But I had to change the way that I related to this history as I delved into these images and learned about some of the artists behind them, the stories behind them, the reason why, in this case, these two particular pieces of artwork that are kept in the Huichole Art Center, or the Erika Art Center, by Yvonne Negrin, why these yarn images have been kept, why they are sacred, why they are so important to understanding some of the peyote roads that have traveled through this territory. It's been a real honor to get to meet artists and also challenge some of the ways that I had come to learn this material in the past, or the ways that I had read about how other people had interpreted this past. So this is one example of this belongs in sort of a bit on mescaline, the Native American church, and the way that peyote has been part of different, not only ritual settings, but also folklore tales, different ways that people have used oral histories to remember different cosmologies, different connections with ancestors. And I'm using generic language here intentionally because the language changes even when translated into English as you move across different borders from Mexico all the way up to parts of Saskatchewan and beyond now, but in a legal sense. I was also really fortunate, and some of you may be in the audience here. I hope that Osiris Gonzalez is here. He could certainly say more about these images, but one of the other things was another humbling moment, or many humbling moments in this story, but is trying to understand how different images have come to challenge our views of history. Now, the top image, this codex, was something that I didn't readily understand, but talking with Osiris and with archaeologists and linguists who he connected with, we came to appreciate, or he's already come to appreciate, how incredibly rich and meaningful these tapestries are. This, in this case, this codex, which scholars now believe is an example of pre-Hispanic pre-contact, pre-Hispanic mushroom ceremonies. And I won't begin to try to unpack all of that, what's in that image for you. But what I was really excited about is the way that these images have survived all sorts of historical interventions. They've survived documentation, they've survived persecution, and we still have, although rare, some of these images to represent this importance of, in this case, mushroom ceremonies in pre-Hispanic era. The other two images might be more familiar to you. The mushroom statue on the left, which was found in Guatemala, it actually circulates in a number of books, including Gordon Wasson's book or Albert Hoffman's book with Richard Schultes. And so too can you find the other image that has been colored there on the bottom of what ends up being page 27 there. So some of these are more familiar, or at least have been repeated across a variety of different publications, and some are quite rare, but perhaps challenge our understanding of where these mushroom ceremonies were first being recorded and the vibrancy with which they were recorded. And again, we see, a concentration of this, and here might be a little bit of, the remnants of Richard Schultes' work, as well as Albert Hoffman and Robert Gordon Wasson, as I mentioned, collecting, cataloging, and showcasing some of these statues, some of these epitaphs in their own work. But also, if we move outside of the sort of north-south corridor of the Americas, we can also see other ways that these substances have been captured in a variety of different contexts. And although controversial, there's a whole history that is connected, of course, with Chinese herbalism and different Chinese legends. Now, depending on which historians you talk to, and luckily I'm in a history department with some great friends who helped me work through the Chinese history here, there are deeply contested stories as to whether or not Chinese herbalism belongs in this tradition. Although if you go back about 60 years in the historiography, you can find moments where these kinds of stories change a little bit. And there's a deep reflection here of the way that the history has changed with respect to the contemporary attitudes towards drug laws in China in China specifically. And nonetheless, what I wanted to do is not to try to create a definitive explanation of what counts inside this framework, but to acknowledge that really there are so many different ways that people have come to understand the relationship to these sacred plants in some cases, or these non-ordinary states of consciousness, or the way that plant-based teachers have helped people to think differently about their relationship to one another and the planet. I won't go on too much about St. Anthony here because I want to use that time to talk about Hieronymus Bosch, an 18th century Dutch painter with this triptych of this, different kind of scenarios that may unfold after ergot poisoning. And it, I really like this, not only because it's a beautiful painting in and of itself, or a beautiful series of paintings, but I was recently rereading some of Gordon Wasson's work, and it was an essay that he wrote right after his wife died. I believe it was 1961 that the article was published, and his wife, I believe, died in 1958. What he described in an article was that he felt that there were two different ways that cultures around the world had taken to mushrooms. Now, of course, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Gordon Wasson, he's an amateur mycologist. He and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, traveled to Mexico. He first met Maria Sabina, and he tried mushrooms, and this gets sort of spilled over, splashed through the pages of Life magazine, and gets sort of memorialized as the moment when the West has its sort of first mushroom trip. And his name becomes synonymous with introducing magic mushrooms to at least English readers through Life magazine. But upon reflection, he's thinking, and he's been studying mushrooms alongside his wife for a long time. He had this idea that there were certain cultures that were microphilic and others that were microphobic. And I think this 18th century triptych helps us to think through those ideas a little bit more. This idea that some cultures kind of embrace the idea of mushrooms, and you might see that, he certainly sees that in what he sees in Mexico and Guatemala, and others, and he points to Europe in particular, as being fearful, as associating the effects of the magic mushroom here, in this case ergot, as being something that brings chaos and destruction. And in so doing, he describes this article where he really kind of breaks up the world into, sort of pro and anti, or microphilic and microphobic cultures. And I found that a very useful way to think through some of the images that come that I've come across over the course of this research. Here, this image of Gordon Wasson does not appear in the book. I just pulled that in just so we had to have a face associated with him. He's somebody has had a bit of a rough ride, I think, in recent years, as his name overshadows two really prominent women, his wife, as I mentioned, Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, and Maria Sabina, who was a curandero or a Mazatec woman who introduced him to mushrooms in Mexico. And for a number of reasons, I think the women's names have faded from history, and I think it is important that we recognize them, of course. But I will say that poor Robert Gordon Wasson, that's my bias here. I appreciate what he did in part because he spent the rest of his life continuing to build this incredible library of mushroom lore or mycological lore. And it's owing to him that we have a lot of the images that we do, including some of the ones that are here on this page. This is not to turn over the patriarchy or anything like that, but I do want to acknowledge that he spent a tremendous amount of time and his own personal wealth, he was a banker, collecting some of these images, some from French artists, like the one you see there on the right. This is a Fabre piece of art. I've got a couple of examples in the book, and others that he found primarily through his contacts in Mexico. So he really tries to, use those illustrations to carry forward the story, as well as some of the songs that are associated with the mushroom ceremonies. And it's one of the themes that I tried to thread throughout the book, that ritual is not something confined to a particular era, nor is it confined to a particular place. But we see ritual and ceremony really animating the story of, and I'll use psychedelics here in quotation marks, even ideas that, of course, predate the concept psychedelics. The image on the left is from an iboga ceremony. And interestingly, these particular images come from the Guardian magazine And the reason we have these ones is because we had copyright access for them. Many of the iboga ceremonies, we were unable to get copyright permission to reproduce those. So although these may be staged photos, I cannot verify that for certain. It was really important for us to be able to include the idea of these iboga transition ceremonies in the book as really important rituals that represent a different part of the world than some of the other ceremonies that we're perhaps more familiar with, or that we have many more illustrations of. In the center is, of course, Richard Schultes. Here he is in Colombia receiving tobacco. And this, of course, is, to me, a really important image. I think the editors would have said that I was using this in an illustrative way, like to prove my historical point, that this is a really important father of ethnobotany who traveled throughout the Amazon, and along with Elmer Smith, the artist who illustrated his work, particularly for the Golden Guidebook, is really important for sort of opening up our ideas in this anthropological and ethnobotanical journey through the Amazon, as he brings together different cultural ideas alongside images to really try to depict and open up our minds to different ways that people might come to know plants and their meanings. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, some of you may be familiar with these images. This is a Pablo Amaringo depiction of a particular ayahuasca journey. He's perhaps the most prolific ayahuasca artist, and many of his images have been curated and made available from Eduardo Luis, who very graciously shared this image with us so that we could use it in the book. And this is a more recent interpretation of an ayahuasca ceremony relative to some of the other earlier rituals and ceremonies that are depicted in the book that, from like pre-Hispanic contact era Mexico, for example. I also cannot get away from an enduring fascination with the kind of medical history or the experimental history or the desire to kind of taxonomize or to go out into the world in this quest for understanding and harnessing the power of plants in something that I might say is, part of an industrial complex or part of a pharmaceutical, small pharmaceutical and later big pharmaceutical industry. And yet what I was really struck by with some of the images that continue to flow through these spaces is, questioning, who are the chemists? And here I just choose a couple of images from the book. One is a sort of Bayer stock image of aspirin, which was seen as a major blockbuster innovation, of course, this new pill that was going to help with pain relief in many ways. But another image from an anthropologist, Wade Davis, on the right-hand side, and both in terms of Wade Davis's writings, but also more broadly within the context of thinking about ayahuasca and its history. You think about the kind of chemical composition that goes into the ayahuasca brew, and it should, I hope, trouble us when we think about who has the upper hand on the rigors of chemistry here, and we think about the way that psychedelics and the way that those psychedelic experiences have been a blending of plants and chemistry and artistry that come together to produce different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing. On the top there, this is another, I love this image, although it is not specific to psychedelics per se, just another one of these depictions of the relationship between the West, in this case France, and in this case the global South, or I think this is Peru. Just the way that has been depicted in 19th century imagery. Perhaps there's a power dynamic that we might want to unpack here. But this was something that I really wanted to showcase in the book in images, or the way that images have helped us to think about those narratives. I also really wanted to include images that piqued our curiosity about some of the people who have come to know psychedelics, who've come to be, some of them are regular characters and others are lesser known characters, who took psychedelics specifically to stimulate curiosity. Now, they may not have taken psychedelics alone. I mean, absinthe was also a favorite drink of some French philosophers, but those who were, sort of bold explorers in a variety of different ways, some to inspire different philosophical renderings on the world, others to write literature, and others perhaps we might see, or maybe we might agree with Mike J., are just psychonauts in and of themselves. They're interested in these kind of consciousness voyages. And so again, this is a theme that I try to weave throughout the book that is not confined to one particular place, but pops up in a few different ways. So of course I have some French philosophers. I have Fritz Hugh Ludlow here, who was not only a psychonaut in his own right, but also a great collector of imagery. And I believe the Harvard Archives has his collection now. People like Aldous Huxley, who I've written about in the past. This image, I have to sadly say, is not included in the book, but I snuck it into my presentation because I really just adore this image. I'm allowed to use it in a presentation, but we couldn't get copyright permission for the distribution in the book. So this is just thanks for coming to the presentation. You get to see him peeking through what appears to be a torn sheet, but I can't help but think about the doors of perception as I look at him sort of peering through here. Huxley's legacy, of course, looms large in the history of psychedelics as one of the co-conspirators behind the name, or co-creators of the name. And it's really important to me as I've studied this particular conversation around psychedelic for 2 decades now, and to have included some of this information as well, that this is not something born of a particular discipline. This is not something that was isolated to a particular group of people, but actually, we have a philosopher, someone studying literature and contributing to literature, but who is the son and grandson of and brother of well-known biologists, who was meeting with a psychiatrist who had an earlier life as a playwright, and they've fused together these different ideas as they try to find something capacious enough in the word psychedelic to inspire people to think outside of boxes or through sheets or doors, if you will. One of the ways that Huxley, and to a slightly lesser extent, his colleague Humphrey Osmond, one of the ways that they sort of pushed these boundaries was by openly embracing some of the elements of spiritualism that they thought were really important within the context of studying consciousness. And although I found this perhaps one of the more difficult elements to depict through illustration, here is where I've got a couple of images here from a shoebox in someone's closet. The image on the top right, it's not the best image in terms of a quality of a photo, but you may recognize Albert Hofmann there. He's also depicted behind me on this piece of art, and he is talking with Eileen Garrett. So here's my photographic proof that Albert Hofmann met with a woman who was at the time considered the foremost psychic in the world. She was hired a number of times by different governments. She's seated here holding Tomorrow magazine, a magazine that she sort of co-founded. It existed before, but it had run dormant. She reinvigorated it. And it's the first place where Doors of Perception was, a review of it was published. Tomorrow magazine is a magazine of the occult. It is a magazine of spiritualism. And it's an interesting element of this history that I think is often overlooked, but I think is really important. And I struggle to try to depict it, but I hope that these images sort of point us in that direction. I've talked about this in a previous talk when we looked at psychedelics around the world, but this was something that really sort of fed my enthusiasm for this topic, and trying to think, calling all of my friends in other parts of the world who are studying psychedelics, some of these images again may be more familiar to you. The picture of Allen Ginsberg in India has certainly been published in a number of places. Ken Kesey's bus is perhaps well known to many people, but some of the other images were a little bit more buried. I tried to find access to a short-run Japanese magazine. You can see this, the Buzoku, or the tribes, and Buzoku just simply means the tribes. And there was a short run, kind of what we might say today as a zine, but this relatively cheaply produced magazine. And I'm told, although I haven't seen a copy, haven't held one in my hands, I'm told by colleagues in Japan that this was a really important magazine for explaining not only where you might find supplies, but how to take psychedelics. In this case, LSD is featured quite prominently, but also different music you might want to listen to, or places you might go to appreciate music under certain influences. And so I wanted to just sort of point to some of these other places that were also developing their own local cultures surrounding psychedelics and have their own sort of aesthetic history and aesthetic quality to that, which might not be readily comparable to an American aesthetic, for example, or even we might look to the Rolling Stones here on the left, who look a little bit like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to me, but that's for another conversation. And finally, on the topic of curiosity and this kind of using psychedelics to enhance as opposed to treat, I called this one the Eureka effect, or seeing the world differently. And I was really struck by some of the conversations and some of the biographies that came out more recently about tech giants. We might think about Steve Jobs, for example, Michel Foucault, not a tech giant, but a change maker in many ways. In fact, my class was just talking about him today, or Stuart Brand, who gets us to think about the environment and environmentalism in different ways. But these sort of folks who attribute to some of their out of the ordinary thinking to their relationships to LSD, sometimes not upfront, sometimes it takes, you know, a posthumous publication for that to come to the surface. And I don't know that Foucault ever claimed that LSD changed his way of thinking, but I think that well, if you read the two books that are written about his LSD trips in California, it certainly amplified some of his critiques of power in the world. Oh, and I'll quickly add at the bottom there, Mad Pride. One of the things that I also found in finding these images was the striking, you know, there's some stuff that's really sort of obviously anti-state or anti-establishment, and Mad Pride or anti-psychiatry are subtle themes that play out throughout some of the images. And I wanted to sort of toss that out there as one example of another way that psychedelics have been infused with a different kind of project of challenging the state or challenging authority. I'll move on to the last section then, which is this is something that gets a little bit meta for me. As I said, I move off the words from the page and start really trying to think about the way that images are making me think differently about this history. And so here I'm going to sort of quote what has become attributed to Marshall McLuhan, you know, this wonderful Canadian philosopher or media studies expert. And there were a number of images that I thought, you know, these are kind of neat. Here's Jimi Hendrix with an exploding guitar. That's neat. Ken Kesey reading a comic book. That's also pretty cool. But the more I learned about those images, the more I kind of fell in love with what they represented. And it's not just, you know, this interesting depiction of an exploding guitar. But this image actually comes from a photograph that was taken by someone named Linda Eastman, who later becomes Linda McCartney, and is, of course, the heiress to the Kodak company. And so I was thinking about the way that technology has fundamentally changed the way that we can capture some of these images and what that has come to represent as well. And this was sort of a fun, playful way of trying to infuse different ideas about the art history and the technology history that lies behind this. And the story behind the Ken Kesey image, which was shared with me by Sunshine Kesey, his daughter, was how much he loved comic books. And as I went through his diary and some of his correspondence, which is at the archives in Eugene, Oregon, what I learned is that some of the ways that he was also trying to communicate ideas was through using this kind of staccato style rhythm or prankster language, or making these kinds of like funny jokes and changing the sound of language itself. And although that's not conducive to an image, seeing him sort of engrossed in this comic book, to me, was a nice illustration of some of the ways that folks like Ken Kesey were not just changing things by engaging in altered states of consciousness, but we're also really interested in changing the way that we communicate our ideas. So lastly on this point, maybe all of you are familiar with this massive stage. I don't know, I haven't actually counted how many, I'll run out of technical language here, but like this could be a loud concert is what I'm going with here. There are many, many speakers. This is quite an engineering feat in itself to produce this kind of sound stage that dwarfs, in fact, the performers. Of course, it's the Grateful Dead that's about to perform on this particular stage, a stage that was produced or created and envisioned by what by all accounts, who by all accounts rather, was a brilliant engineer, and that's of course Owsley Stanley. And interestingly, so we might marvel at the wonders of this technical feat, but by the same token, many of you will know that Owsley Stanley was also an amateur chemist who was also distributing acid, not just behind the scenes, but right in the scene. So not only was he changing the way that a concert goer might experience the sound by amplifying it to such a degree, but he was changing the synesthetic response to hearing that sound and participating in that environment by tampering or, exposing people to, in this case, acid-soaked Kool-Aid, while also playing with the sort of technology behind the sound itself. So I found these examples of these kinds of meta moments, or meta to me at least, really fascinating within this history, and something that I hadn't really paid as close attention to when thinking through the narratives and the chronology behind this, but it really popped as I started thinking about the illustrations, the images, and the way that we might capture this history through that kind of imagery. So a couple other shout outs, and I could do a pop quiz maybe at the end. Some of these things are really common, and I was so thrilled that Caroline Garcia, our mountain girl, very generously shared her backstage pass, which was tucked away in her closet. So again, there's an example of some stuff that you might find very sort of obvious, or you would expect to find it in the book, and other stuff that I hope will be a bit interesting to people who've already quite familiar with this topic. The images behind the sort of changeover in the psychedelic culture into the 1960s, into an era that we moved towards prohibition, I think are equally fascinating. Some of them are Pulitzer Prize winning images, like the one on the bottom here, and others have been featured in a number of different magazines, articles, newsreels, documentaries. And it's a careful and cautious reminder of how these ideas were fused together and how that was illustrated and even popularized through mainstream media. And I won't dwell too long here. Simply to say that during the kind of rollover into a prohibition era and merging with a war on drugs, there's this other proliferation of ephemeral materials, of rather cheaply and sometimes crudely produced guides or recipe books that begin to kind of play with desktop publishing, but also play with different ways of creating a gray and black market for different psychedelic distribution networks. Of course, Blotter Acid, and Eric Davis has written brilliantly about this. If you haven't seen his book, you should check it out. But there are a number of different kind of underground guides, and I'm grateful to the many people who've shared this with me. Mark McLeod and Kat Harrison have been really key for helping me to identify and try to find out where these belong to. Of course, Sasha Shulgin is a key figure in this history as well. All right, I promise I'm almost done. As I rolled into the kind of like more recent history, again, I wanted to not lose sight of some of the earlier themes, the kind of themes of ritual, the themes that are part of the history, but also continue to, I think, change the way we think about psychedelics today, or should cause us to stop and think about that. So I want to talk a little bit about psychedelic tourism and the kind of imagery that comes from that, both the one on the top, which again is a guardian image here, kind of advertising what it might look like to go to a psychedelic retreat. I cannot say for sure whether that's a real one, because I don't have enough information about the image that was published in the Guardian newspaper, and other ones that were shared with me by friends who had snapshots that they were willing to share. The last thing that I will talk about, I'm pretty sure this is near the end, is the place of Indigenous produced art that I try to pull all the way through this book. The image here comes from an artist, Rita Hooney Queen, who's pictured here on the right, and the images on the left come partially from her and from other, in this case, Brazilian artists who are using depictions of ayahuasca to revive language resiliency within their communities. So the proceeds from their art go into language acquisition, language reclamation, language schools for young people living in the Hooney Queen territory here. I find this a really fascinating part of the story that, this is also a story of resilience. It's also a story of psychedelics being connected with something that is very progressive, very generative, if you will, coming back to that kind of themes of resilience. On the right-hand side of the screen is another example of that theme of Indigenous resilience. This is from an Indigenous artist in Mexico, Rene Alvarado, who uses pigment and clay and soil from Maria Sabina's homeland and in the community that she grew up in to produce images that represent her and what she has meant in that area, in that community. And I juxtapose that here with another AI produced image. So these are both from about the same time period. I think the Rene Alvarado, if Osiris is here, perhaps he can tell me the exact date. I think it's 2022. The one on the left is from 2023. This is an AI generated image that was associated with an article depicting the hope that psychedelics bring for PTSD amongst military veterans. So I see this as a really fascinating way of thinking about different ways of drawing in historical images or producing new AI-generated images in this case to look at how psychedelics are invested into very different projects. And maybe I'll leave that for more commentary in the question period. So by conclusion, I just wanted to first thank you all for being here and use this as a point to thinking through the illustrations, the images, the way that those images were created and how they connect with me has really got me thinking about the psychedelic resurgence as an opportunity to reconcile some of these bigger themes, not simply to, convince the FDA of a particular kind of outcome. This is to say nothing of the recent hearings, but to use psychedelics in a broader frame to think about how psychedelics have given Western knowledge systems the opportunity, perhaps, to reconcile with Indigenous ways of thinking about cosmology when it comes to plants, healing, and spirituality, rather. And does this cultural moment also provide us an opportunity to rethink our relationship with the natural world? This poster, by the way, is from a 1970s campaign, which is an anti-drug campaign, but it still uses the same aesthetic. So I just kind of like that idea of kind of flipping the narrative or flipping the script a little bit. I couldn't possibly I didn't have a photograph of everyone who helped me with this book, but I'm really grateful to the many people who have opened up their homes, their basements, their closets. That sounds creepy, but it's not meant to. Their art galleries, their libraries, their hearts, and really helped me to drill down and find different images that have helped me to think through what it means to tell a story in images. And I'm happy to talk about any of these folks if you like. I think Michael Horowitz and I are actually standing in his closet there. If you can see, it's kind of in the bottom middle. And I will just point out the folks on the right. It's through this study of images that I have been connected to the Native American Church of Canada. I was seeking permission to publish an image that I found in the archives. And in order to get that permission, they said, well, you should ask, the community. And of course, I said, sure. And what I found was so much more than permission, but what I found were the ancestors, the grandchildren of the people who'd been featured in those photographs. And we've since launched a new project where we're going back, looking at all of those photographs, naming people, not Indian woman, Indian man, as they were named in the newspaper, but actually giving them their names back. And we've been taking those photographs to the community and working to build a project where we can start to work together to reclaim some of this history and bring that history back into the community. So I want to give a special shout out to Kelly Daniels, who's the man with no sleeves in blue there, who is the sort of pinnacle person who invited me into that project. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Erika. It's a delight to have you here and sharing your work, and we're just so thrilled that you are joining us again on in the Psychedelics in the Future of Religion series. Before we turn to discussion, I just want to note to everybody out there, and there are many of you, I highly recommend and implore you to go out and buy Erika's book. It is truly a sweeping history and also just so much fun to sit with and get a chance to look at all these images and really digest them in a new level. in a new way in your body. So we now are going to turn over to discussion. Throughout the discussion, we will weave in audience questions. So to everybody out there, please add more questions to the Q&A. We have a few in there that will start us off, but please don't hold back. Maybe as a way actually of starting the discussion period, Erika, I'm sort of picking up on your final, or one of your final slides there about the way that this moment cannot just be a renaissance, but actually a reconciliation. And I'm curious to hear about how you see art and aesthetics feeding into this larger project of reconciliation. You mentioned reclaiming names and giving people names, but do you see art as a vehicle for this larger project?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would struggle more than I'm struggling right now to answer it. But it's really striking in going through some of these images and just sort of realizing the embedded stories, the embedded reasons why there are so many reasons why people have kept and hung on to these images in ways that have transcended some of the other ways that people have been pushing the stories underground. Treasured pieces of art, fans, or different kind of ephemera or material culture around this is really a way in to recognizing some of the deep ways that psychedelics have been embedded. And again, I'll use that in quotation marks, but psychedelics or sacred plants have been embedded in different cultural histories. And for good reason, a lot of people didn't want to share that history for a long time, and yet they were able to maintain these elements of material culture or illustrated culture. So it's a bit of a touch point for, I mean, the photographs that we found that, now I'm talking to the grandson of the woman who's featured in these images. His family wasn't able to talk about it for generations. And so there's just a quick example of one of the ways that, those photographs have survived because they seemed rather benign. The stories had to go underground, but we're able to reconnect that now. And I think it is an invitation to take that opportunity to work on some reconciliation.
I'm curious along those same lines where you might see that sort of reconciliation in medicine. I mean, as a historian of medicine, you've noted these points of departure and, perhaps, I don't know, even bastardization of indigenous knowledges. How might you see the sort of future reconciliation along the lines of medicine? Are there cases that seem to point us in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, ask me in a few years, but one of the things that I've been kind of puzzling over for a few years now, and I still don't have like a clear answer, but the way that we use clinical trials to measure efficacy, and I know this is a bit maybe fresh as we, many of us probably paid attention to what went on in the United States recently with the FDA decision, and understanding how to measure quality control, if you will, safety, risk profiles, harm reduction, whatever kind of language we want to attach to that. And when we look at some of the images and open ourselves up to some of the different ways that people have stayed safe in other contexts, free from the kind of clinical language, there's a lot to be learned there for how we measure efficacy, how we think about benefits, or how we privilege or prioritize different forms of evidence when it comes to thinking about someone's physical and spiritual health. And there are lots of examples, and I will stick to where I'm more familiar with, some of the communities I've worked with directly, but certainly in the secondary literature, there's lots of examples that stretch this into other contexts as well. And I think, more than that kind of salutary gesture that like, yes, we need to pay attention to like Indigenous people too, but actually like importing or allowing for those conversations to include something that go beyond like doses, or I don't know, something that's quite sort of specific, but opening ourselves up to thinking about this at a cosmological level. It's quite scary. It's quite, humbling. It's, I think, something that makes people quite nervous. And, I was on a call with some representatives from Health Canada not too long ago. That's not where the conversation starts. You can't say, what you need to do is, flip the script or, completely open your mind to this. And yet I think there are opportunities to weave in these different ways of knowing that could be really positive. And respectful and reciprocal. It doesn't need to be extractive. I think there has to be, a different mechanism for relating to one another in that way.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat here on a publishing decision to place sculptures or stone objects against a white page background, and then in a parenthetical, instead of in place, or in an archive or where they were taken from, as if they're floating in a non-marked white space. The question is it just the reality that these objects are forever detached from their cultural context now that they are in circulation?
It's a brilliant question that I'm sure I won't have a satisfying answer to, because part of this, this is my first foray into doing this. And so part of this was, designers would suggest something and, they had different justifications for some of this, but that's not really an excuse. That is one piece of it. One of the things I think that struck me, and as I try to think around these objects, is a number of these objects have already been sort of removed from their cultural context, and they're sometimes found on shelves or in cabinets or in museums, and I almost would rather have them suspended in space than as part of choose your favorite national museum here. I won't pick on anyone in particular, and I guess I struggle with that a little bit too, how best to position these. And I will say that aesthetically, which again, historian of words here usually, but seeing them suspended was actually quite striking. And that kind of 3D effect that they have was a way to capture the sculpture that avoided a two-dimensional flattening effect. And there are trade-offs in all of these decisions, certainly, and I'm not a designer, but I appreciated that kind of three-dimensional piece, something that is really difficult. And I've seen in Plants of the Gods, for example, Hoffman et al., they include some of the same statues, and they're set on a black background, and they kind of melt into the background a little bit. I would say, maybe others will disagree. So I don't know. I love the question. Thank you. I don't know how to answer it in a way that, but going forward, I think there are ways to sort of in place or keep those artifacts in place. The artifacts that I featured have already been removed. So that was a tricky piece too.
Of course, the hope is that the text on the page, which I do also implore people to read as well as looking at the images, hopefully does a lot of that. Or it does do a lot of that contextualization work.
Staying on the theme of contextualizing and ways of knowing and thinking, I'm going to combine two questions from the audience. One is a question, I'll just read it. Are we still being led by Western frames of curiosity, prohibition, resurgence, and even art? And what might other frames for thinking about psychedelics teach us about different conceptions of existence and happiness? So that's part one, and I want to put that in conversation with another question, which is around theorists, art historians, or other theorists of art who could help us rethink the role of psychedelics, the importance of psychedelics, and look at these ideas through maybe a non-Western frame.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to the second question, absolutely yes. And I am not claiming to have done that and to have deeply engaged in art history theory. I haven't. And I would love to do that more in the future, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are certain Western frameworks that run through this. I tried to acknowledge that where possible, and there's more material, or my access to the material was also, I have limited Rolodex friends and access to archives and whatnot, and so you try this. But I really wanted to draw attention, even in cases where, sometimes the designers who are not necessarily experts on psychedelics, they're like interested in design. They're like, no, like this picture is just not, it's grainy, it's this or that. I said, no, but it's the only one we have. For example, the Bazuku tribes. This was something that I really fought for, because it's important that we recognize that there's a different aesthetic tradition that comes around the same time. It draws on some things that the text would be familiar, like here's where to find, here's a good show to go to, these sorts of things. You can find that in the San Francisco Oracle too. But the aesthetic is quite different. And the fact that it exists and there's a short run, and there's one artist who's particularly associated with it, I think that is just, I hope, just a kind of morsel of inspiration. And I am not in a position to, do the full research on Japan, but maybe somebody will see that and say, hey, there's something else here, and I have the language skills to do this. And I really, really hope that that happens. I tried to do that as much as possible with some of the options that I had. So working with Rita Huni Queen, for example, was something I was really, really excited when that relationship, we were working through a translator on WhatsApp. I mean, during COVID, it was, not ideal circumstances. But we were able to make a nice donation to their community as well, and to hopefully, honor that and showcase this kind of work that's happening that you're not going to find if you like Google psychedelics. And yet it is part of that story of reconciliation that's not really in the frame of psychedelics, not sort of part of the psychedelic renaissance or anything. But this is a different way of thinking about what does it mean to grow up in this community with a shrinking language base, as she has explained. What does it mean to be an artist reclaiming that? So again, it doesn't give it full treatment, but I hope that by including her work, it opens up those possibilities. Or maybe like it turned out that one of the people working on the production line is Brazilian, and he recognized that I was struggling to describe some things. So he called some friends, and we were able, it was exactly what I was hoping for, not knowing who he would be. But we were able to draw in some other examples that I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. So I hope it serves in that sort of, in that way, that this is definitely not the end. It is merely like one attempt.
The book as a whole, I think the first opening page is just sort of defining what is psychedelic. I mean, it's in big letters here. What is psychedelic? Is such, I mean, I think it's a more ambitious question to respond to than, the words on the page imply. And this also comes up in the edited volume Expanding Mindscapes around Iboga and Ibogaine specifically. What does it mean to sort of pull Ibogaine or Iboga into what we're calling psychedelics? And I think this will be a really important, or it is a live important question as the psychedelic humanities comes into its own. That I think there is much to learn from, like in the, I don't know, history of sexuality. There's a book from the 90s. I cannot remember the title, but it's something about sexuality in medieval Europe, where she talks about, what does it mean to call a person queer in the past? They didn't have that word. They had a different set of categories and taxonomy to describe sexual difference. And yet, as a historian in the present, I have a connection to what this person is describing in, 13th century Europe. So how do I sort of work with, queerness across time or something like that? I think in the psychedelic studies world, we're dealing with very similar questions around what is it that we can sort of include under the banner of, what is, sufficiently psychedelic, or what sort of has the quality of psychedelic. And so I'm curious how you are sort of engaged in the ongoing wrestling in that question, specifically in the context of this book, and then perhaps Expanding Mindscapes as well.
Mm-hmm.
What does that work look like as we're incorporating historical phenomena or cultural phenomena that don't necessarily work along the terms of psychedelic, but seem to have a sort of resonating quality. Foucault called it an intensive vibration through time, or something like this, as he's,
Yeah.
reading 2nd century records of gymnasiums or something like that. How do you see this question in the history of psychedelics?
And maybe you could see me squirming sometimes when I was saying the word psychedelic, and I'm trying to do this, and it's this awkward thing, and yet it's this shorthand that allows us to grasp a certain concept as we travel through time and even into other places where that word wouldn't resonate even today, even if it were translated. So yeah, I very much, I take that question, I struggle with it, and yet, not to put this onto editors and publishers, but you like to not have psychedelics in the title also, you're like a thing that is not that it, they're like, just use the word, right? Like get your keyword in there. Anyway, but again, with that side, blaming others. One thing that I've talking to anthropologists and ethnobotanists about this is again, like really trying to think about, well, how do we understand these frameworks in another language, in another culture, in another like way of understanding and thinking about our relationship to the planet? And I've repeated that phrase, but it's been helpful to, the cautionary tale has always been like, don't call it psychedelic. Don't start with psychedelics. You don't show up or I shouldn't show up in a Indigenous community and say like, got any psychedelics, or what does psychedelic mean to you? Because it's a dead end and it cuts off that conversation. And so, with deference to that idea, I don't want that to be it is kind of a container that I'm using in this book, but I try to poke holes in that a little bit and show that there are also ways of understanding things like transition as a concept. Although of course psychedelics are not associated with all transitions, but the way of thinking about transition in the iboga ceremonies is a really good example of that. These transition moments are punctuated by sometimes these ceremonial contexts. And if we think about transition, we think about different stages of life, there are ways that ceremonies and the ceremonies themselves are not, except to, those of us who are looking for psychedelics, they are not psychedelic ceremonies. These are ceremonies of many things. And there may be something in that ceremony that somebody isolated at some point and later classified as a psychedelic. But in those ceremonial contexts, they're not psychedelic, or psychedelic is the wrong frame to put on that ceremony. Otherwise, it's just like, it's a way of classifying them and sending information to RCMP officers or police officers, depending on your jurisdiction. But it isn't really a true capturing of what that moment entails or the meaning of that moment. So I try to embrace that as much as I can with the limits of language to sort of acknowledge that it's my kind of rough shout out as well to like Chinese herbalism, which is not psychedelic. And they're not claiming to be psychedelic. And yet there's a way of thinking about using plants in relation to different ways of stimulating consciousness that we might think of as like, we could learn something from that within this larger context. So it's rough and ready in places, and unfortunately like more superficial than it should be in some places, but I hope that it plants those seeds of inspiration for thinking about like where does the frame fray, or where are the edges of that frame, and what might we think of that goes outside of the psychedelic bubble that actually is really helpful for imagining where the edges are, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And the title of the book that was escaping me earlier is Getting Medieval, Sexualities and Communities, Pre- and Postmodern by Carolyn Dinshaw. So if anybody is looking for a method for their next trans-historical psychedelic project, a place to start.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this sort of poking holes. I mean, I love the poking holes in the category of psychedelic and recognizing that in so many contexts, it's really a flattening of what's happening. I mean, and also a flattening of the unique substances. That's one of the things I think the book did really well, was recognize that we're talking about a large class here. And ketamine works very differently from MDMA, which works very differently from LSD, and the set and setting, all of these things. And so sort of acknowledging that project and really being a supporter of it, I'm going to ask a question that completely flattens all sorts of these categories, which is, as I was reading the book, I was very curious about the way in which you are conceptualizing and arguing a psychedelic aesthetic. What is a psychedelic aesthetic? You talk a little bit in chapter 6 about the sort of synesthetic nature of psychedelic aesthetics, at least in this particular sort of 1960s context. But I'm curious if you came to any other, maybe not a grand theory, but sort of a sense of what is the family resemblance across art and aesthetics with these diverse class of chemicals?
Gosh, yeah, I did a bit of a deep dive thinking about like sort of San Francisco streetscapes and soundscapes and the smells. And I was really trying to think about, embracing that synesthetic quality, because you hear that word and that phrasing used quite a lot. And it's a place where I found the most purchase with that concept, thinking about mixing all of these senses in, like, whether or not you're actually on psychedelics, but, at some of those concerts, at some of these festival spaces, you see it in the posters, you can smell it, in the pungent, acrid air of the streets, and I can only imagine, I mean, I wasn't alive in the 1960s to experience that. But, cannabis is legal in Canada now too. So, but just sort of thinking about the way that, like, all of the senses are present in some of these moments. And so that's a place that I found, it worked and it had purchase. I'm not sure. I don't think there is a psychedelic aesthetic, like psychedelic aesthetic. And I know this will sound silly perhaps, but set and setting really matters. So the set and setting of, this psychedelic expression really changes when you are in a ceremonial context. And there are many different kinds of ceremonial contexts. Those ceremonies also have their own aesthetic quality, their own acoustic qualities, and to say nothing of the spiritual and emotional context of those ceremonial settings. But looking at artwork from, for example, an ayahuasca ceremony, you compare that with a peyote ceremony, with an iboga ceremony, the tradition of artwork that is produced in those contexts is quite different. The fact that those pieces of art help us to understand stories and connect with ancestors is something common, but I wouldn't say that's an aesthetic quality. So actually, I'll disagree with whatever I said in the book, that there is an aesthetic. I think there are moments where we sort of see this, and it has sometimes, I think, been used to undermine, let me put that differently. I think that the idea of a psychedelic aesthetic was used to create anti-drug literature. I'm going to use, like, the last image that I showed in my conclusions there. Like, it's an anti-drug thing, but it's meant to look kind of groovy, right? Like, it's meant to be recognizable as something psychedelic. So there's a way of kind of caricaturing this particular version of a psychedelic aesthetic in order to also twist and undermine it. But I don't think it captures the diversity of the things that I'm hoping to capture in this book, which I think are a much more expansive set of ideas that connect with ways of engaging with things that we later call psychedelic.
Yeah, great. So we so often in this series sort of come back to the political project that is always surrounding psychedelics, and in some ways art too has become part of this larger prohibition or just sort of a political project of othering. So that's a phenomenal answer. Sticking actually with philosophy and theory and historicization for a second, Osiris Gonzalez Romero is on the call and did put in a question here, and says it's wonderful to see you again. But his question was actually about something you mentioned on page 12, which is you state that to direct us to the text, you state that quote, psychedelic history has often been explained as a history of ideas, end quote. Osiris is wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what you were thinking when you wrote that and what it means to think about the history of psychedelics as a history of ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Osiris. Tough question. I mean, I know I should always know exactly what I meant when I wrote something, right? I should be able to answer that. I guess part of what drew me to psychedelics in the first place was the idea. Many people have asked me throughout my career, what was my favorite psychedelic, or, what was the first one I took, or these questions around my own consumption. And of course, that question is fraught. And when I was, defending my PhD in like 2005, I absolutely lied and said I didn't inhale, which seemed to satisfy my examiners, which just tells you how much has changed in the past few years that no one would get away with that today. Anyway, I was drawn to the question, not of, what's my favorite psychedelic, but like, why were people invested in a project where they thought psychedelics were going to change the way we deliver medicine, the way we think about this? It's the kind of the politics of it, I suppose, in some respects, that drew me to that project in the very first instance, and it has sustained me throughout. So maybe it's more a reflection of my own attachment to psychedelics as an idea, not something that is, necessarily measurable or exact or precise, but something that hopefully, as I see from the way that Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley talked about it, something that is like, I don't want to say ephemeral. That's what Osiris and I talked about that for a long time before. But something that allows you to project different kinds of hope into a psychedelic project. What if, think outside the box. What if we used, our acid trip to develop the mouse, as, apparently Steve Jobs did? Or what if it's not whether it's ketamine or MDMA or LSD, it's the idea that this somehow this inspiration or this way of thinking differently, changing our consciousness, would allow us to think differently. And it might not be good different. I know there's a lot of debate about that in the literature right now too. Does it make us less capitalist? Does it make us more capitalist? Does it reinforce ideas? I don't know. But I do think that, investing in the ideas behind psychedelics, the idea that psychedelics can potentially help us to think differently or think about a problem differently, that to me is what has always sort of sustained me in the study of psychedelics, that this could somehow, what if thinking about psychedelics makes us imagine a different way of measuring health outcomes? Like maybe the clinical trial isn't a good way to measure success. It's not because of psychedelics, but it's thinking with psychedelics, if you will. Or what if psychedelics help us to think differently about disease categories? Like if I can put myself into this state, does that state require treatment? And that's something I'm borrowing a little bit here from, I saw someone had talked about Duncan Blewett. That's something that Duncan Blewett had also mentioned, that these ideas of like tampering with our sense of what is real or what is rational, and maybe opening up the possibility that we need to rethink some boundaries or rigid categories that we've placed on things, whether that's a pathological state or a condition in the kind of psychiatry side of things, or whether it's how we measure success. And when I think about clinical trials, I don't know if that's a good example or a couple of examples of what I mean when I say, psychedelic ideas or thinking with psychedelics, as opposed to like thinking on psychedelics.
I'm sorry, Paul, did you want to jump in? Oh, I was just going to pick up a thread that you sort of tossed out here, which was really beguiling me a little bit, or just catching me also while I was reading. And you mentioned this a little bit when you mentioned the zines and the Japanese zines in particular. But there's a way in which psychedelic art seems to be calling people into the psychedelic experience in some way, and oftentimes very literally, where art is paired with a guide or a seller, or this sort of community that is then going to usher you into the experience. And I'm having sat with this archive, I'm curious if you have a sense of, first of all, do you think that's unique to psychedelic art, that it has this, I just off the top of my head, I don't look at most paintings and think, oh, I have to go do this thing. But maybe that's just my perception. So I'm curious if you think that's unique to psychedelics. And if so, what do you think exactly is going on there? Why is the sort of act of taking psychedelics so tightly married to the art that comes and sort of surrounds the substances?
Can I cheat in answering my question with a, can I share my screen again?
Yeah, please.
Sorry. Let's see, where did I may have closed my tab here. No, I think it'll still work. Okay, I'm gonna cheat. Okay, so if we look at this, my thank you page in the top left-hand corner, this is a bookstore owner in Paris, France, whose name is escaping me at the moment. We spent a lovely afternoon together. This is in the basement of his bookstore. And what he has done is collected what we probably would quickly recognize as like psychedelic art. It's like poster art, primarily that which was produced in the San Francisco area. He's tracked down which artists, and there's, a handful of them. And then what he does, and you won't be able to appreciate from this particular quick image, is he traces its origins, and he finds so much of it in French modern art. So he goes, some of them are 50 years, like he takes these different images that just get kind of a groovy font and whatnot. So in doing so, and I'll stop sharing there because the image isn't the best other than to kind of gesture towards that. In doing so, what he shows us is that this whole thing is a mirage, that, he does it from a theoretical art perspective. He did an exhibit on this in Paris. There's no book about it that I know of. He said he's working on it. And if anybody's interested and wants to email me, I will look up his name. It is just not going to come to me at the moment. In any event, what he does is he kind of pulls it all apart. And he said, this poster art that we think is like hyper psychedelic is actually French modernism with these 6 fonts and these like wavy letters and these colors that altered the aesthetic so that it tricks us almost into thinking that is something new and that it is something specific. And it's such a fascinating corrective. And his research on this is incredible. Like he just has these little snapshots. He's like, you can read about it. If you go to his store, you talk nicely to him, he'll show you into the basement where you can go, and he's got QR codes for several of them where you can find like this Italian art from the 16th century that is popularized and funkified, if you will, or groovy-eyed, I don't know, grooved up, so that it looks like something that came out of the minds of like someone who just came out of a Grateful Dead concert, or Jefferson Airplane, if you will. Like it doesn't have to be them. So it really got me thinking about how flimsy that aesthetic might be, or how specific regionally in time and sort of temporally specific it is. And perhaps, myself, I too have been sort of tricked into thinking, this is like quintessentially psychedelic, but it isn't. It's really kind of collapses in time and place into a particular thing that is of course influenced. Who knew? It was influenced by other artists along the way, many not credited, but then some of them aren't credited later on either. So that's my that's my answer.
I have a question about audience and who you saw this book as intended for. As I was first sort of opening it up and flipping through, I was reminded of like a sort of introductory history textbooks that I once encountered, especially with the sort of like single page spreads on, a particular moment or a particular figure. I was imagining, this book maybe finding its way or precipitating intro to psychedelic history courses. So I'm curious, who the audience you imagined for this text was.
Yeah, I think that for me changed over time, and perhaps the overarching editors really had, from Quarto Press and later MIT Press, had like a clear vision for that, but I certainly did not. Initially, I was like, oh, this is, I'm writing a history of psychedelics and it's going to have some nice illustrations and it's going to try to show that, these ideas have traveled around. But as I got more into the images, like, oh, this is different. This is changing what I think, but also, so I was like, oh, okay, so I want it to be familiar to people like you who already know a lot about psychedelics, and I hope there's something in there for you as well. You can skip over the parts, the beginning parts, but I also wanted to kind of be a little bit provocative. So what they said is for each chapter, I could choose a kind of pull-out section, if you will, and those are the ones on slightly colored pages. And so I thought, okay. So I wanted to profile people or places that might be less, that you might expect less of. So, the specter of women. Instead of choosing Jerry Garcia, I decided to go with Grace Slick as like an icon of acid activism, but also as a way to, or not that kind of aesthetic, right? But also, she writes about this in her own work as like this being a bit of a tricky time for women, that it wasn't all glory and, this wonderful White Rabbit song, which was great, but also there was a lot of sexism. And so it was a way that I could also play with some of those, not play with, but to introduce some of those ideas that, again, you might expect, but just to kind of like trouble that narrative a little bit. And some of them, I mean, I will just fully confess that, I've spent way too much time transcribing letters that were handwritten by Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond to let that go and just pretend I hadn't. So I'm like, no, this is going in again. Like, it was just, that's my own personal bias. But instead of focusing on the things, some of which we know, like the word psychedelic, I wanted to use that as a bit of a launching point to think about his wife, Maria, his next wife, Laura, who not only sort of helped him through different phases of his life, but really pushed him, Maria in particular, into these directions towards spiritualism. And so Huxley's there because we might expect it, but then I wanted to use that to kind of elongate that and say, like, other than his, famous biologist and eugenicist family, he also is connected to his wife, who introduces him to these amazing women who really challenge him in his thinking about how can we write about and articulate forms of consciousness that we can't grasp, or that we can't grasp in the empirical model, right? We don't have the science behind it, if, again, to go from his family. And I wanted to use that to sort of veer towards that, as a way of showing, like, he's also nourished by these other things.
Along those same lines, with spiritualism as a sort of secret current in psychedelic history, namely in Huxley, mad pride was another one of those sort of, tangential elements to the sort of stronger sort of history of psychedelics through line. And so I'm curious what that process was in sort of inviting these other forces to be conversant with psychedelic history. You see the role of psychedelics playing in generating momentum around similar movements like mad pride, or psychedelics as part of a deeper frustration with social norms and institutions in a similar way that mad pride was. What is that sort of that process in inviting new forces that perhaps were not sort of directly conversant with the psychedelics into this history?
Yeah, I mean, part of this might be my antipathy towards thinking that we will have won some kind of war, just to use that metaphor, if psychedelics get legalized, we're all good, right? And I'm very kind of circumspect or cautious or even quite nervous about that prospect, because I think that would almost be a loss. Like, that there are all of these other things that psychedelics allow us to think about and talk about, that are not, the regulatory state of their position in society. The mad pride piece is another element of that. And I never had the fortune to meet Humphrey Osmond in person, but I spoke with him on the phone. And, this was like, oh gosh, it probably was 2002. I think I was a, naive doctoral student. I didn't know anything. And, this guy who I came to study for the next two decades, he'd had a fall. So his daughter was quite cautious about, talking to somebody who was probably going to tell all sorts of things about his psychedelic past. And I think, there's some protection there. Anyway, it didn't end up that way at all. But one of the things he said to me that has stuck with me ever since is, the thing he was most proud of was helping to co-found Schizophrenics Anonymous. And here I was like expecting him to tell me about psychedelics, and psychedelics were there, but it was kind of like going into a ceremonial context and saying, where are the psychedelics? It was sort of a non-starter. So rather than starting with psychedelics, and this is, again, 2002, conversation was quite different. But even that, we didn't start by talking about psychedelics. We started by talking about schizophrenia and how important it was to him that he still had people who connected with him who felt that they were able to love a part of themselves that they never could before. And I'm kind of summarizing a few different things that people have shared with me, including one more recently, a woman who worked with Osmond, who had also been diagnosed with manic depressive disorder, I should say, with psychosis, said that it was through Osmond and her LSD experience that she was able to see herself as whole. That she wasn't like this broken part and this sometimes good part or sometimes broken, but she was a whole person. And these were parts of her that were all her. And reading letters from patients to him or former patients, and reading some of the tracts of, so there's one guy who wrote his biography or autobiography rather about Schizophrenics Anonymous. I came to appreciate just how powerful that was. And for them, for some of these patients, some who I met, some who I've only read about, the idea that some psychiatrist would take a substance that at that time he really didn't know that much about. I mean, I don't know how much he was talking to Hoffman. Anyway, and in their minds, like, go out of his mind to know what we go through was something incredibly powerful. And some people wept as they talked to me about, the brave doctor who took them seriously. And when he, in a very sort of simplistic way, just said, like, that's the thing he's most proud of. It, like I said, it stuck with me, it resonated with me. And it's one of those pieces that I'm like, mad pride, or this idea that you could be proud of yourself and, have a diagnosis or resist that diagnosis perhaps, but is something really important that psychedelics also have something to teach us about, or even just the study of psychedelics. Again, you don't have to take it, you could think with it. Thinking about pathology and psychosis in this case is really important. So that's why I put there.
Yeah, that is, I think, a beautiful place that we can conclude our conversation here. Thank you, Professor Dyck, again, for sharing your work with us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your wonderful questions. We're grateful to the Center's director, Dr. Charles Stang, Lori Sedgwick, our events coordinator, and the rest of the CSWR staff for their support. And as mentioned at the start, we have many more psychedelics-related events this semester. Our next event in the Psychedelics and Ethics series will be on October 10th at 5:30 in the Cotter Room at the Divinity School, also accessible via Zoom. Where an expert panel of chaplains and scholars will discuss the state of psychedelic chaplaincy and imagine possible futures for the field. The discussion will feature Dr. Bonnie Glass-Coffin, professor of anthropology at Utah State and co-convener of the Transforming Chaplaincy Psychedelic Care Network, Dr. Caroline Peacock, a director of spiritual health for Winship Cancer Institute at Emory University, and Dr. Jamie Beachy, a field scholar at Emory and co-founder of Naropa University's Center for Psychedelic Studies. Registration is required, which you can find on the CSWR calendar. And our next Psychedelics in the Future of Religion event for this semester will be in the same online format as this event on October 22nd. We'll be in conversation with visual artist Karen Lofgren on her book, Embruhada, Charms for the Living, and the larger project series that this book fits into on cures and curses. Registration is required, and you can find that also on the CSWR calendar. And with that, we will bid you all adieu for the evening. Thank you for your attention, for your thoughtful questions, and we wish you a lovely rest of your evening, or beginning of your evening, or whatever other time it may be where you are.
Sponsor, Center for the Study of World Religions.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard